So, good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to come and talk to Bradford AS. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Liverpool, but my research doesn't involve astronomy directly. I work in the physics department, and astronomy has always been a hobby of mine. But one thing that has tied together virtually all of the research that I've done over the last 30 years or so has been imaging. So many times I've been involved with looking at images from microscopes that can see individual atoms or individual molecules. I'm now looking at images that might be produced by an infrared microscope, for instance, looking more in the area of medical physics. But imaging has always been a part of my interest. So I've always been interested in photography, and I became interested when people said images that are supposedly taken by the Apollo astronauts have been faked. I got interested in the idea of moon hoax. And after I've given a few moon hoax talks, people asked me, well, what about UFOs? And I thought, well, that might be interesting, because you can ask yourself the question, as I've stated here, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation? Or if you look at images that are supposedly UFOs, can you tell what they are by looking at them? Or can you tell if they are genuine or faked? And that's how I ended up writing this particular talk. So, where do we start when talking about UFOs? I am not going to be talking directly about conspiracy theories. I am not going to be talking about reports of sightings of UFOs. I'm not going to be talking about alien abductions. I'm going to be talking about images. But it helps just to get the statistics sorted right from the off. And I tried to find out how many people believed UFOs are an indication of extraterrestrial visitors, of aliens visiting the Earth. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. I won't embarrass you all. But I found a survey in which people were asked, have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth? And in a survey I found, the answer was an astonishing 40%. Now, admittedly, this is Chapman University, and this is American, and it's 2018, so it's a few years out of date, and it's American, and I believe they were surveying youngsters, probably university students. But even so, even if these are young Americans, that's still an amazing percentage, that 40% of people believe that aliens have visited Earth. If you ask a slightly similar question, how many believe that extraterrestrial aliens are walking amongst us? How many are visiting as we speak? You might think that was a much lower number, but in fact it's almost the same, 35%. 1/3 of American students thinks that aliens walk among us. That's staggering and worrying for all sorts of reasons. It's actually less than the number who believe in ghosts, apparently, but it is bigger than the number who believe in telekinesis, and it's also bigger than the number of people who believe in Bigfoot. But the most startling statistic I found in this particular survey is that more people believe aliens walk among us than believe in the theory of evolution. Now, I'd love to know what the numbers were for the UK or Europe. This is only America. Still, it got me thinking as to, well, is it worth then having a look at the various images that are out there to see what we can learn? I found this rather useful graph, which shows you the percentage of the US population carrying cameras with them everywhere they go, every waking moment of their lives. This, of course, is an indication of smartphone usage. Nothing up till about 2000, and then along comes the iPhone, and suddenly this number goes up close to 100%. So you'd expect most of the population of America and Europe and a lot of other countries in the world to always have a camera on them. And so the quote that was made was, well, with very little fanfare, we've now conclusively settled the question of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, Bigfoot, etc. Because if everybody's got a camera, then surely in the old days when very few people had a camera, you wouldn't often catch a picture of Bigfoot or a flying saucer. But these days you would expect everybody to be able to take these pictures. So surely the question is now settled. Well, no, apparently not, because I tried Googling UFO to see how many web pages refer to UFOs. It was about 250 million last time I checked. I do not claim to have checked all of those 250 million web pages to gather data for this talk. It is very selective in that respect. So it implies that no, it's not settled. But I believe you can break down UFOs into various categories. UFO images that are abounding, i.e., let's just say for the sake of argument, the ones on the web, the ones on the internet, those images could either be of man-made objects, or they might be of natural objects, or they might be image artifacts and not actually out there but only inside the camera, or they might be deliberately faked. And those are the four major categories that I think UFOs can be broken down into. The elephant in the room, of course, is that there is a fifth category, and that is that they could be evidence of extraterrestrial spacecraft. I don't think that's the majority of them, but just how much of a minority, well, we shall see. We're going to look at a few examples. But let's make sure we've got the definitions right first. So I'll conform to the usual convention of a UFO, an unidentified flying object, to mean an object that's observed, not necessarily in the night sky, and is not readily identified. Now, of course, there's all sorts of things you can't identify. You might see a bird in the sky and not know which species it is, but you still know it's a bird, so that wouldn't count as a UFO. And regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I definitely side with Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And another useful tool, of course, for the rational scientist is Occam's razor. If there are two explanations for the same observation, then the one that requires the least speculation is, if you like, the preferred, or is usually better. And that's often just reduced to a simpler way of writing it. Simpler solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. If there are two possible explanations for what we're looking at, one is a very complex explanation and one is a very simple explanation. That's not a guarantee, but it's usually the case. The simple explanation is right. So where do you find reliable information about UFOs? You can go trawling anywhere you like. There are definitely places you can go which give you reliable information about UFOs. For instance, the UFO Information Center in America, where very conveniently they have a little alien sitting on the porch outside to greet you as you come in. But perhaps that's more for tourists than anything else. So where are we going to get information? Well, it would be lovely if we just got a picture like this. It would be great if people would take pictures of UFOs that were clear and detailed, in focus, so we could see what it was they were supposed to be photographing, without any camera shake, without any camera movement, and correctly exposed. That would be great if we could find any UFO images that were correctly focused, correctly exposed, etc. But unfortunately, we don't find images like that. You will find that 99.9% of the images you find on the internet are a little fuzzy blob. They're usually blurred, they're usually out of focus, they're usually the result of camera movement because whoever took the picture didn't hold the camera steady, maybe because they were rather excited. And virtually every picture of a UFO taken at night almost universally is overexposed, so you can't actually see what it is you're supposed to be looking at. Making it bigger doesn't help. It just turns a small blob into a big blob, and you still can't tell what you're looking at. So in terms of, is it sensible for me as somebody who deals with image analysis as a sort of bread and butter occupation, does it make sense to look at these images? Well, not really, because if all you've got is a little blob, then you pretty much cannot tell anything about an image like that, especially when the image is more than a couple of decades old, because it probably wasn't taken on a digital camera, which means we've got no idea of who took it, where it was taken, which way the camera was pointing, what was the focal length, what was the aperture, what was the shutter speed. None of that information is recorded on old analog emulsions. Therefore, we've only got the statement of the person who claims to have taken this picture, and we cannot definitively say, I know what that is, or I can't even think of claiming to know what that is. I've got no idea what the magnification was. I've got no idea what the zoom was, what the focal length, etc. All I can reliably say about this object is that it was brighter than whatever it was in, whatever the sky was or whatever environment it was in. Apart from saying it was brighter than whatever was behind it, that's pretty much all you can say about this object. So that rules out more than 99% of UFO images, I'm afraid to say. I wondered if I could find an early UFO image, and I thought, how far back can you go? What if you go beyond the 1950s? Well, we've got hieroglyphs here which clearly show an Apache helicopter in the top left, and Luke Skywalker's land speeder here, and I presume a Zeppelin. So what were the Egyptians doing putting these on their hieroglyphs? When I first saw this image, I assumed that the image had been doctored in Photoshop and somebody had just played around, but no, that's genuine. That's what the wall actually looks like. I can't remember actually where this wall was. But no, there are these symbols on a rock, on a stone. So you might ask yourself, well, did they have some inside knowledge about what was happening in terms of visitation? Well, possibly. Or there's another explanation, and that is that there were two pharaohs, Seti and Ramses, and they each had their own set of hieroglyphs. And when Ramses came along, instead of completely destroying Seti's, he tried to sort of chisel his own hieroglyphs over the top, like printing on a piece of paper that already had some printout on it. Quite why that happened, I don't know. But if you take these two sets of symbols, which are completely innocuous on their own, and combine them together and imagine that they were both on the same piece of stone, then you can see why we get that particular illusion of a helicopter and a land speeder, etc. It's nothing to do with those. It's just, I don't know, a tool and a bird, and I don't know what these things are, but there's nothing particularly remarkable about them. It's purely the fact that these have been superposed on each other that makes us think there's some interesting symbols there. So no, we can't go back to the Egyptians for proof of UFOs. So let's have a look at a few images. Let's start with man-made objects, man-made things. Now here, the US Air Force is trying to make life easy for us. Rather than say, yes, there are lots of UFOs flying in the sky, and there might be a few spy planes up there as well, they've tried to make it easy to identify all the objects that you might see in the sky. And I'm not sure if you can tell what these are. The top left one, you might think it looks like a spy plane. No, it's a weather balloon. And that's a weather balloon, and that's a weather balloon, and that's a weather balloon, and that's a weather balloon. Any idea what this one is? Swamp gas? No. And weather balloon, and weather balloon, and weather balloon, and weather balloon. So the US doesn't want us to know about their spy planes, so of course they're very happy to have us talk about UFOs, because it just takes the emphasis away from the fact that they've got the B-2 bomber taking off at an airfield not far away from you. So that doesn't really help much, because we know what the military is like. They're going to be a little bit secretive. So here's an interesting image, a long exposure photo of what? A fleet of UFOs flying in formation. Perhaps you can see it and perhaps you can't. There's a little dark object here. That just happens to be a leaf on a branch of a tree which is sort of getting into the photo. So there's nothing interesting about that blob or the tree on the left-hand side. But you might ask yourself, what is this particular stream of objects that seem to be moving into the distance? You might say, well, it's not necessarily UFOs. Perhaps it's, I don't know, is it commercial aircraft flying overhead? Well, you don't get commercial aircraft flying like that and leaving contrails. Commercial aircrafts will tend to fly at a particular height on a particular route, if you like. They don't tend to fly on parallel paths like this. So it's not likely to be commercial aircraft. What about military aircraft? Well, military aircraft will fly in formation, but they tend to fly in much tighter formations than this. So what do you think we're looking at here? Any suggestions from the audience as what we're looking at? One meteorites, one lights, bright lights, lasers. Oh, I see lasers from the distance. Yeah, interesting. Other people have come up with other ideas, but in this particular case, I know what these are because the person who took this picture has not claimed that this picture is a UFO. This is me being deliberately naughty and trying to misdirect you, because this is not a long exposure photograph. If I tell you that this is long exposure, you tend to think of objects moving through the sky. But that text does not belong with this picture. I'm doing this deliberately because that is what you sometimes find. If you go and find yourself a UFO picture, there might be a description next to it, but there is absolutely no guarantee that the text that accompanies a picture belongs with that picture. And in this case, it definitely doesn't, because I've just invented it. But that's something you do have to look out for. Whenever you see a picture, whatever text is there is not necessarily the text written by the person who took the picture, who knows how the picture was taken. Sometimes it's just literally invented. And I know this is not a UFO, or at least the person who took it claims it's not a UFO, because I know the source of this particular image. It wasn't a long exposure, it was a snapshot. And the snapshot came from Pylon of the Month, December 2019. Yes, there is such a thing. So what are we actually looking at here? Well, it's a foggy day, and foggy night rather, and somebody took a picture of an electricity pylon, and you can't see the pylon because it's foggy. If the pylon was around, it would be there. But you can't see it because of the fog. So what are we looking at? It's the cables, it's the electricity cables of a 400 kilovolt transmission line. And they happen to be illuminated by some light just over the horizon. Who knows what that is? But if I tell you it's a static picture, you come to a completely different conclusion than if I tell you it's a long exposure of objects moving through the sky. So that's something you have to bear in mind whenever you're looking at images. And for those of you whose interest I've now piqued, yes, if you want to, you can go and look at www.pylonofthemonth.org. I see people are writing it down already. Yes, okay. It's an exciting web page for those of you who want to actually check it out. Yes. And people do go around the country taking pictures of electricity pylons. I kid you not. Okay. But if you see something like that, there can't be many people who are surprised by something like that and think, wow, can that be anything but a giant jellyfish? I mean, clearly. Some people were waiting for this event. In other words, a rocket took off and left an exhaust plume in the sky, and if you're expecting it, you take a picture and say, doesn't that look pretty? But if you didn't realize that rocket was being launched that evening, and you catch it just after sunset, so the sun is catching the exhaust plume of the rocket, you might be very surprised to see this in the sky. Now, those are now getting a little more common because Elon Musk et al. Are now throwing up rockets by the dozen, whereas if you go back a few years, this was a relatively uncommon sight. But now it is, especially in America, relatively common. And people go out of their way to photograph the exhaust plumes from the rockets that have been launched. If you catch them just at the right time of day, just after sunset, you can get some glorious sights. And in this particular case, the rocket is going into the distance, and what's left behind looks almost like the sort of nebula that you might pick up for those astrophotographers amongst you. So that is a known man-made object, but it still occasionally catches people out. Whenever you get a rocket launch, you still get lots of UFO reports sent to the police and elsewhere. In this particular case, the rocket plume, not a Falcon launch in this particular case, but the rocket plume originally might have been a straight line or a little bit of an arc, but over time that plume gets disturbed by air currents in the atmosphere, and in this particular case the pollutants that are left in the rocket plume end up producing this wonderful iridescence, again as light from the sun is just catching the top of this rocket plume. Then you get these beautiful iridescent colors. But if you weren't expecting that, it might look indeed very, very unusual, and you might convince yourself this is some sort of unidentified flying object. This falls into the same category. If you knew it was going to happen, you wouldn't be surprised by it. But if you simply look out into the sky and you suddenly find lots of blobs, a large blue blob and some small cyan blobs and some wiggly blobs below them, it looks really, really unusual. So if you didn't know what you were looking at, some people's knee-jerk reflex is to say, I don't know what it is, so it must be a UFO, as opposed to, I don't know what it is, I'll go and look it up and see if people know what it is here. In this particular case, this was an experiment. Sounding rockets were sent up. I think this was a NASA experiment. They sent up rockets, sounding rockets, released gas that fluoresces into particular colors when hit by the sun's rays, again done just after sunset, and by releasing various fluorescent gases at various heights and then monitoring how does that gas cloud change if you watch it as a function of time, how does it expand, how does it move. It tells you about the temperatures and pressures and air currents at high parts of the atmosphere. which is useful for those people who want to study the northern lights, the aurora borealis, for instance. So this is simply the result of a scientific experiment. If you knew that, no surprise. Otherwise, that can catch you off guard. A lot of these were around for a while, but now discontinued. Google Loon, they sent up large satellites to bounce radio waves around. I don't think they're using them now, but the original idea was, why not put lots of these large reflective objects in the atmosphere, let them float around, and then it'll bounce radio waves so that you can talk from A to B over long distances. So I haven't got any pictures of those in the sky, but I'm sure large spherical objects floating in the sky would have been considered and indeed were reported as UFOs. I think they haven't been around for quite a few years now. This is perhaps less unusual than it was a few years back. Perhaps you can recognize what this is, especially if you realize once the video plays. Most people would not be surprised by a sight like this. If you go back 10 years, this would have been really surprising and would have produced a whole load of UFO reports. But you know what this is? Everybody knows what it is? A drone display. These days, the precision with which you can get the drones to move is much higher than this, which is now a relatively old video. You can now get the drones to move in formation to much higher precision. So I would expect that it won't be long before they get drones to actually fly in the shape of a flying saucer, and that will get the UFO conspiracists back again. Other people say, well, I haven't seen UFOs, but I've seen where they land. I flew over Nevada a few days back, and I saw what were obviously 3 landing sites for UFOs in the middle of nowhere. It can't be anything else but UFO landing sites. Well, perhaps. Or the alternative is to sort of figure out what time you saw these. You know you were flying from A to B, and you saw these at a particular time. Why don't you just go on Google Earth and find out what it was you were overflying at the time? Do you actually find UFO bases on the Google Earth map? No, you actually find a solar power plant with lots of reflective mirrors, all angled such that they reflect the sun back to this central point where you can generate very high temperatures. Depending on the angle at which you view these mirrors, some of them will be reflecting light to you and some won't, and so you can get this rather odd effect. If you're far enough away, you can't see the individual mirrors, but you still get this odd impression of something that looks very unearthly in the distance. So again, perfectly understandable. Let's have a look at somebody's video. This is fairly typical of somebody videoing a UFO who's never heard of the idea of either a tripod or holding the camera steady. This is the best this individual can do. He's convinced he's looking at a large cigar-shaped object hovering over the lake, clearly a UFO. How can you possibly deny that? Eventually he says, oh, he's had enough, he's going home. But despite the fact that this particular UFO sighting was very quickly refuted, it was refuted by the people that were on board the UFO because it was in fact the Goodyear blimp. Quite definitely us. Sorry to break into a good story, but that is quite definitely us. Despite that, the story, the video still went viral on YouTube, and I'm not sure what other social media circulated around the world. I don't know how many million hits it had, but even though it was discounted within probably half an hour of the original video being posted, an explanation isn't as interesting as the video itself, and therefore people will retweet and repost and continue to watch YouTube videos long after the actual explanation has already been put out there. And when it comes to odd objects, well, yeah, unidentified footwear objects. Almost anything can appear in the sky. Witness the fact that Nike decided to put footwear into space. They simply put it on the end of a weather balloon, sent it up to beyond 100,000 feet. The point being that anything you see, the only interesting thing here is look up at the balloon. That's what happens when the balloon pops. When a weather balloon pops, that's what happens. So in other words, when you see odd things floating around the sky, if it can be one half of a pair of trainers, it can be pretty much anything, because people are unlimited as to, well, if I can lift it, I'll send it up there and see who's interested. So you can't assume to yourself, that looks rather odd. Well, it can't be a trainer. There's no way a trainer could be at 50,000 feet. Well, Unfortunately, it can. I was delighted when I came across a YouTube video that said, for the first time, super clear footage of a UFO. Not just clear, not very clear, super clear footage. I thought, fantastic. Somebody finally has got a nice clear image of a UFO and they've held the camera steady. Right, what did that video look like? Okay. Any takers for what that was? Apart from a UFO? Admittedly, after about 10 minutes, the guy on the camera settled down a little bit, and eventually he managed to steady himself by leaning against a wall or something. It's either a J, or it's possibly on its side a horse or a unicorn, but it's certainly a party balloon. It is definitely a party balloon. It's a mylar reflective party balloon that's catching the sun, and mylar balloons will reflect all sorts of colors when you see them in a sunlit sky. So there's nothing particularly interesting about that. It is simply Johnny or Jennifer or somebody had a party and the balloon drifted up and it got so high it glinted in the sunshine, and then somebody with a super zoom lens eventually tried to get a picture of it. So this super clear footage of a UFO turns out to be not a UFO, as you would expect. Enough of man-made objects. What about natural objects? There are plenty of natural objects that are mistaken for UFOs. I don't know if you know, but there is a Cloud Appreciation Society. Some astronomers get used to this idea because they keep getting in the way of observing. And there is such a thing as Cloud of the Month. For those of you who are excited by Pylon of the Month, hold back, because this is Cloud of the Month. And every month they have an interesting looking cloud. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these ideas of lenticular clouds, sometimes giving the rough impression of a circular disc-like object hovering over the sky, especially over mountains. But occasionally you get rather intriguing ones. Here's a low cloud base. There's a bird flying over. That's not particularly interesting. But why should there be a large, apparently semicircular appendages to this particular cloud? It doesn't seem to be a complete circle. It seems to be a semicircle, but when you look at it, it looks like an almost perfect semicircle. Why should a cloud decide to have little appendages below the cloud base that look like this? Well, you can postulate all sorts of possibilities, but one thing to bear in mind is there is an airfield only a few miles away. And what happens when aircraft come into an airfield and the airfield is busy? They're put into a holding pattern, which is quite often not just a circle. They often go on a straight line, semicircular turn, straight line, semicircular turn, a racetrack, or, if you like. And so it's quite probable that what we've got here is an aircraft being put into a holding pattern before landing, and this is the semicircular end of the racetrack, and the aircraft is either long gone or possibly slightly higher altitude than the base of this particular cloud, but the passage of the aircraft could still disturb the cloud in such a way that it ends up producing these little protuberances below the cloud. So when you realize you're close to an airfield, your explanation changes quite dramatically compared to if you're in the middle of nowhere. Another nice example of a lenticular cloud. This one is quite nice in the sense that it's almost completely circular and disc-shaped, not quite, but very close. So again, understandable when you first glance at this that it looks rather odd. That's one of my favorites. It's not particularly UFO-ish, except that those of you who've seen Independence Day, when you remember the spaceship coming out of the cloud as it comes down to Earth, that sort of rather dramatic view of a cloud can make you think of what's going on inside this cloud to give you that sort of structure. And I've seen these sorts of pictures on lots of UFO sites where people have said, here is clear evidence that a large flying saucer has come down to Earth, punched its way through the cloud, left a large circular hole punch in the cloud, and then the spaceship has come down and is down here somewhere. Well, okay, you might explain a big circular hole in a cloud from the fact that a spaceship has gone through it. Or you can look at a meteorology page which says this happens sometimes. I'm not going to go through the meteorology, but when the temperature is right, when the pressure is right, when the amount of water vapor is right, it is possible for a cloud to start evaporating and end up with an outline of a sort of inverted circle, if you like, a circular hole in the cloud. It's perfectly possible depending on the meteorological conditions. They're called fall streak clouds. So despite the fact that this is a known meteorological phenomena, people still post these things as, look, here's evidence that a UFO has passed our way. And despite the fact that lenticular clouds can be really beautiful, here's a lenticular cloud sitting on top of Mount Fuji. Even though that in itself is a wonderful picture, that doesn't stop people taking the picture, slapping it in Photoshop and saying, well, I can do better than that. This is rather nice. You look at this and you think, what on earth is going on the other side of these houses? How many UFOs must have landed and are now shining lights into the sky? No, there are no spotlights here. No, there are no floodlights. No, there's no circus on the other side of these houses. There aren't any spotlights shining up into the sky as such. But you look at this and you think, well, that's really unusual. We appear to have a whole load of vertical lines, very narrow beams here, almost laser-like in their narrowness. So what's actually going on? Perhaps you can tell from the foreground or from the web address. Foreground is snow, and the web address is something.fi, Finland. So this is Scandinavia. So what's going on here? This is a very cold environment. When ice crystals form in the atmosphere, the ice crystals form like little hexagonal plates, and sometimes those ice crystals end up pretty much horizontal because that's the way they prefer to sit in the Earth's atmosphere. So in a sense, you've got lots of tiny little mirrors sitting there in the atmosphere. So what they're going to do is to reflect whatever is below them. So all that's happening on the other side of these houses is there's a whole load of streetlights or just normal city or town illumination. But all of the ice crystals directly above one particular light could reflect that light back to your eye, and so you see these vertical lines, these so-called light pillars. Sometimes you see it with the sun, a sun pillar immediately below the sun. Here we're looking at ice crystals in the atmosphere, and they are simply reflecting the lights below them. Some of the lights are slightly pink, some of the lights are slightly blue, and so the light pillars simply take on those colors that we're looking at. Here, the same sort of thing. The lights, you can hardly see. The lights are in the distance behind these line of trees here, but again, you get the light pillars, some of them particularly strong by the looks of it. Some of those lights are blue, some of those lights are pink, and so you get this forest of what looks like light trees in the distance. Sometimes that's unusual, but sometimes it's absolutely spectacular. I've never actually seen these for myself. I've never been far enough north, I guess. But the idea of seeing these lights in the sky, if the ice crystals are quite high, they can reflect lights that are quite some distance away. So we can see the distant lights of, I don't know if that's a town or an oil field or something else in Alaska, who knows. But you notice that the lights can appear a long way separated from the origin. The light pillars can be separated from their origins. So if you walked out onto a night and you saw this city in the sky, apparently, again, if you didn't realize what was going on, it is quite reasonable to say, wow, there seems to be a city hanging up there. What on earth is going on? Are we being visited or not? But once you realize the atmospheric conditions, it's all easily explicable. Sometimes the ice will sit horizontally, but will start to waver at different heights. The crystals might start to tilt more, and then you get the ice pillars, the light pillars, starting to trumpet out like this. So they're quite well defined up to a particular height, but at some, I don't know, 30 or so meters above the ground, the ice crystals start to waver because of the atmospheric conditions at that height, and so these light pillars start to flare out, giving a rather odd-looking result. This is from This is from Wisconsin, so not Scandinavia, but somewhat lower latitudes. What's this person seeing here? They've got a house on either side to block out the sun. They're looking up at a cloud. But what's going on in the middle of the cloud there? Something's jumping around. Is there an alien hiding in the cloud jumping forward, jumping right, jumping left. It seems, when you look at it, something is moving extremely fast. And it suddenly bubbles out. Let me just run that video one more time. Something appears to move, and then it jumps, and then it gets brighter, then it gets not so bright, then it goes, whoa, and then it goes suddenly to the left. Something is moving very rapidly there. And trying to work out how fast is an object moving, you have to, of course, judge how far it is from you to the cloud to work that out. But some people have said, well, this thing must be moving at incredible speed in order to move suddenly to the left. And how much acceleration must there be for an object to move that distance so quickly in just a fraction of a second? Well, that would indeed be the case if something was moving very rapidly across your field of view. But even though you can see the light changing, actually nothing is physically moving to the left or to the right. We're back to ice again. This is a thundercloud, where you have lots of ice crystals and strong electric fields. There's strong electric charges, positive and negative charges in a thundercloud, regardless of whether it's actually producing lightning to the ground or not. There are still very strong electric fields. And ice crystals can sit in that thundercloud and reflect light to you. And if the electric field suddenly changes because there's a lightning strike you can't see, remember, most lightning is not cloud to ground. Most lightning is cloud to cloud, where you get a discharge of electric current. What can happen is the ice crystals suddenly change the angle at which they sit, because that's determined by what electric fields exist in the cloud. So what you've got is trillions of ice crystals that suddenly reorient themselves and change the reflection of light. Nothing is actually moving backwards and forwards, but almost instantaneously all these ice crystals are suddenly changing because of the cloud conditions changing, making it look like light jumps from A to B. But it's purely an optical effect of how ice is reflecting sunlight. You don't often see this, and it's only fairly recently these have been photographed. This is what's happening above clouds in a thunderstorm. We're used to the idea that when you have clouds and lightning strikes to the ground, you see very bright white flashes. Well, actually, you can get sometimes called upward lightning, but that's not a very good term for it. Sometimes you can get electrical discharges up from above the clouds rather than down from below the clouds to the ground. And these flashes, these electrical discharges above a thundercloud, are quite often red and usually faint. This particular picture has made them redder and brighter than they will normally look. But if you go back a few decades, people weren't actually sure if this actually existed or not until photography was good enough that we could reliably capture these so-called red sprites of discharges that occur above a thundercloud. You can't really see the thundercloud, it's sort of sitting here and presumably dumping lots of rain on this town in the distance. So again, red sprites, if you ever saw them, not knowing what they were, you could very easily misunderstand and misinterpret what it is you were looking at. This one, I think, given that I'm talking to astronomers, this one you will probably recognize fairly quickly. This was an arc-shaped UFO seen over Ontario, which again did the rounds and has got an awful lot of hits in terms of being reproduced on social media. Somebody claimed that near the end of the day, I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. Any takers so far? In truth, I cannot be sure what it truly is. My conclusion? A UFO. Knee-jerk reaction. If you don't know what it is, it must be a UFO. Well, how big was it? Well, my friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. If you really can't see any detail and you don't know how far this object is away, how can you possibly make a call as to what the size is? A lot of people make this mistake of saying, I think it was that big. But if you don't know the distance, there's no way you can judge the size. In this case, the friend thinks it's as big as 2 airliners. The person who took the picture disagrees. I thought it was 1, but then maybe he's right. And what was he looking at? An arc-shaped white object in the western sky after sunset. Yes, we would recognize that as Venus. So you can see Venus as a crescent with a relatively modest pair of binoculars. In other words, a magnification of times 8, a magnification of times 10. If you hold the binoculars steady, you can see the phases of Venus. And therefore, if you've got a camera with a zoom lens, which is at least, I don't know, times 10, these days, of course, you can get cameras with times 20, times 50. I've even seen a times 100 optical zoom in a camera. So yes, you can certainly get the magnification as long as you can keep the camera steady enough. And yes, that looks like a crescent Venus to me. And the description fits entirely. So again, you have to be careful. I've seen UFO reporting sites which have a banner at the top which says, Venus is an evening star. Do not send us UFO reports of Venus. In other words, check it's not Venus before you send us a UFO report. They're getting so fed up with thousands of people telling them there's a really bright object in the west after sunset. So we've looked at man-made objects, we've looked at natural objects. UFOs might be image artifacts. In other words, there's nothing actually out there. One of the earliest I could find was this from 1952. Mysterious lights were seen in the sky, photographed over Washington, D.C. It looks to me like that's the Capitol building. And there seems to be a little fleet of UFOs, quite a few of them, flying in the distance behind the dome there. And you might say, Occam's razor, well, yep, that might be a fleet of UFOs. But is it not possible that if you look at the lights in the foreground, and you take those lights, and you turn them upside down, and you take them to the top, is it a coincidence that every light there corresponds to two there, two there, two there, two there, this one, etc.? In other words, what we're seeing is just a reflection of the lights in the foreground. If you take a picture of an object and there's some bright lights there, no matter how good your lens is, it's quite possible that you're going to get a reflection somewhere in the lens itself. There's a lot of air to glass surfaces that can produce a reflection. And given that it's absolutely clear that the pattern of objects here matches exactly the pattern of the lights in the foreground, upside down, because reflections nearly always end up upside down on the photographic film or the CCD once they've reflected off a few lens surfaces. So even though this was reported in newspapers, nobody stopped to think, well, is it possibly just part of the image itself? It's just an artifact of the way the picture was taken. This is a more extreme example, and another example where you might find a picture and then you might find a description, but no way does the description actually relate to the picture. Because with this picture, I found this description. It was a large craft. It came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image. And I think by windows we mean this region here where clearly the pilot is staring out and smiling at us. This UFO sighting is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. Must be serious, because aliens is in capitals, note. Yeah, that's right, that's how serious this is. There is no way that that is a correct description, because this is an image artifact which is only in the camera. It did not exist in the sky, and therefore the person cannot have seen this. This description was added after somebody took the picture, looked at this and thought that's weird, and then came up with the description afterwards. And that's something you have to watch whenever you look at any image which has got a description or text or narrative with it. You cannot guarantee that narrative is accurate. So what is this particular beastie? Well, it's actually a crop from a much bigger image in which somebody has photographed, I'm guessing, the full moon, from the looks of it. And the full moon has come right into the camera, and the camera was not a particularly sophisticated one. The lenses were probably not multi-coated, and there is a horrible reflection of the full moon, distorted like nothing you've seen before probably, a very distorted reflection of a very bright overexposed object causing this odd-looking structure. But it's got nothing to do with what was in the sky, everything to do with the way the picture was taken. A more recent version of the same thing, this time on Twitter. I don't tweet personally, but I just found this and realized it was part of a Twitter feed. Somebody posted this image and said, what's this in the sky? It seems to be an object with a couple of appendages, just like the spaceship in Independence Day, and it seems to have a little aura around it. There appears to be a sort of oval around it. So it's, what is it? It seems to have an aura. Is it a UFO? And because this is Twitter, it was accompanied with hashtag UFO. And to make it clear that this person was being entirely reasonable, she is genuinely asking, I don't know what this is, does anybody else know what it is? Hashtag serious question. So they were basically saying what's going on. Given that my expertise is image analysis, it took me probably less than 1 second to figure out what's going on here. Why? Because a bright object is in the field of view. Whether you're photographing the moon, or in this case, the sun is creeping into the image, if a bright object is in the field of view, you're going to get a reflection of some kind. How do we know that's the reflection? Well, let's just blow it up so we can see it a little more clearly. What would we expect to see if the sun was coming through and being reflected? The sun is a disk, but of course it's half hiding behind this wall. So it'll be part of a disk shining through the filigree of this particular lamp holder. What are we seeing in the reflection, which remember is upside down? We're seeing a circular disk, which is partly cut off by the wall, which is currently on the left rather than the right because it's upside down, and we see the filigree work of the lamp holder coming through there. This is exactly what you would expect to see if the sun was just peeking around that wall, shining through the lamp holder. So this is by far inexplicable. This is exactly what I would expect to see if the image was taken under these conditions. In fact, if you showed me this image without that artifact, I would be surprised and I'd be looking for the artifact because I figure there should be one there somewhere. Another example, this is the sort of thing that really does irritate me, where the narrative bears no resemblance whatsoever to the image. I looked at this image and thought, what is it we're looking at here? And the narrative said, well, this is a picture. Unlike most UFO pictures where there's a lot of camera shake or camera jerk, this one doesn't have any. Note the power lines in the photo. As you can see, the wires show absolutely no distortion, which would indicate no camera jerk. In other words, they're claiming the camera is absolutely rock steady. Also, based on the wires, you can tell we were shooting almost straight up. So firstly, what on earth do they mean by the wires? I don't think I can see any wires in there. There is what looks like there might be a scratch going across the image, and there's another one down here as well you can hardly see. So I took that image and simply played around with it to try and reveal a little more of what we can see there. Now you can see there are some streaks which look like scratches to me. These are definitely not wires, and they are definitely not sharp, indicating there is no camera jerk. And based on these wires, you can see we were shooting straight up. No. This looks to me like a picture out of the side of a car or van or some moving vehicle. I think we're looking at a wing mirror there. And I think this is the illuminated road ahead with a bit of a verge. We're looking on the left-hand side here. So I think that's partly headlight illuminated verge, and over here the same verge but not illuminated by headlights. And that's something in the distance on the horizon, perhaps. So I think this is a very blurred, longish exposure, maybe a fraction of a second, pointing out of the side of a moving vehicle. It is not looking at wires, it definitely has camera movement, and it is definitely not looking straight up. This narrative is either deliberately misleading the reader into trying to see things that aren't there, or this narrative simply belongs with a completely different UFO picture and they've got mixed up. This happens all the time, that you see a UFO image and you see a little description, and the description is trying to convince you there's something in the image, but actually it's basically, well, let's not put too fine a point on it. It's basically a lie. This one is one of my favorites. A large slab-like object in the distance there. What do they describe it as? A flat rectangular aircraft with lights all around the edge. You can see the lights all the way around the edge there, hovering in the air. And just to add credence to this particular image, UFO conspiracy theorists have claimed it is an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Notice how much authority is gained by actually identifying what type of UFO it is. It's not just a blurry thing in the sky. This is a TR-3B, guys. I mean, good grief. This must be interesting. How often do you get a TR-3B photographed? So you could look at that and say, well, it's clearly a TR3B, whatever that is, some large rectangular object. Or you say to yourself, okay, what do I see in the picture? It's a picture taken at night. I see headlights and I see dots, which I think are raindrops. So are these raindrops on a windshield? Are we looking at a picture taken by somebody through the windshield of a car or truck or other vehicle? And if it is looking through the windshield of a car, is it possible that this is a large slab in the sky floating there? Or is it possible that it's simply a reflection in the windshield of an iPhone sitting on the dashboard? What would that look like? Well, it would look like a large rectangle with a little slightly reflective band around the outside, and there wouldn't be much else to see if it was simply sitting on the dashboard and you were seeing a reflection of it. Occam's razor. Is it an iPhone or is it a large slab in the sky? I think I know which one I believe. But I just enjoyed the fact that they were identifying it as a TR3B to somehow give it more credence. We've looked at man-made objects, we've looked at natural objects, we've looked at artifacts. What about the fact that some people post images of UFOs which are fakes? Now, any image which needs a finger pointing at it so you can tell which is the object we're supposed to be interested in, that's obviously just a little bit of fun. And anybody who claims to have seen that, you'd think, well, if there was this thing hovering over an American interstate, I think a few people might have noticed. Perhaps a few million people might have noticed if this thing did actually come out of the clouds and start hovering over a city. So nobody particularly believes images like that, not least because it is so easy to fake images these days. 20 or 30 years ago, it was tricky. During the Apollo moon landings, it was very difficult to fake images. These days, it's of course dead easy to fake images. So what about this? 2 UFOs buzzing Air Force One. Is there any indication that this is a real image? I looked at this and I didn't do any strict image analysis on it, but I looked at it and very quickly determined that this doesn't look right. Air Force One looks quite blurry and not particularly high contrast because it's in the distance, and the air between us and Air Force One, of course, is scattering the light and producing this particular result. If these things really were buzzing around Air Force One or just hanging slightly behind them, wouldn't they also have their light scattered in just the same way? There's just as much air between us and UFOs as there is between us and Air Force One. So how come they've got a completely different contrast compared to Air Force One? The underbelly of Air Force One, well, there should be very little light coming from there. The only reason we can see light is because of the scattering of the Earth's atmosphere. So why is there so little light coming from the underbelly of the UFO? Even if it was jet black, you would still expect scattering to produce a lot more light from that region. So the contrast did not look right on these objects. So I didn't do anything quantitative, but I was fairly convinced that doesn't look right. That looks like fakery to me. This one I thought I could do something a little more with. Here's a triangular UFO sitting on a deck of a USS carrier. So we've got a jet here, a helicopter, and a UFO. So is it possible that that's a fake? Is it possible that it's actually a big airfix model that they actually put onto the deck of a carrier just for a laugh? You never know with sailors. But I thought, is it possible just to verify whether or not there's any sign of that image being tampered with in the sense that it's not a genuine image? So I looked at the brightness of particular pixels within the image. I figured that as far as I can tell, this jet is real. That's what an F-18 jet looks like. So I took a measurement of pixel values just next to the jet. Some of these grays that are the actual runway, the deck of the carrier itself. And I plotted out how bright the pixels are. Doesn't matter what the numbers mean, 60, 70, 80. The numbers are irrelevant. It's just how bright are the pixels as a function of 70 pixels along a line inside that blue ellipse there. And I just chose them all so that they should be roughly the same. They all came out to be about 70. But notice that it is perfectly normal for them not to be the same. Some are high, some are low, and it goes up and down and up and down. It looks a little bit noisy. That's normal for a number of different reasons. Nobody would have painted the deck to be absolutely the same shade of whatever it is, battleship grey everywhere. There's bound to be variations. And when you take an image and when you save an image, there is bound to be some variation because you've taken an image and you've compressed it to make whatever that was, a JPEG image or whatever. There's bound to be variations, what we would call noise, not in the audio sense, but in the visual sense. There is some variation there. So that's perfectly natural variation of a small value either side of about 70. I did that for comparison because then I did something similar for what's going on up there close to the UFO. And I found that you get on the same scale from 60 to 80 over a 70 pixel range, normal noise, normal noise, normal noise, whoa! 72, 72, 72, 72, 72, absolutely dead ringers, and then it goes back to normal. So I can definitively say in that region in the middle there, that region next to the UFO, that has quite definitely been doctored. There is no way that can happen by chance for the pixels to all have exactly the same value over, how many pixels was it, 20 or 25 pixels, all having the same value. Statistically, that is so unlikely, it can be ruled out. So that image is quite definitely a fake. No surprise, we've never heard of triangular UFOs being on USS aircraft carrier decks, but that's easy to prove that that particular image is not a real image. It has been faked. And I found this particular image shocking, new footage of an alien ship over Chicago. Even better, the best UFO sighting in May 2015. Well, if that's the best sighting they've got in May 2015, it was obviously a quiet month. There's, as you can see, a triangular UFO in the sky. Yeah, okay, so I thought, what image processing can I do to bring out what's actually going on in the pixels here? Because we can't see what's going on, but the pixel information is there, so let me address that. So that's what you're actually looking at. What's all this mottling in the background? That is perfectly normal, what you would expect from sky or a flat region of ground or anything else. There is bound to be noise, there is bound to be mottling, there's bound to be variation in pixel values, partly from the original image and partly from the way it's compressed when the image is saved. So this mottling in the background is perfectly normal. But look at the UFO. Its edges are absolutely razor sharp and don't show the same sort of variation that you would expect, which must be there and must be part of the way the image is saved. So that looks far too good to be true. And if it's far too good to be true, it's probably not true. There is no way a real object would come out with edges that sharp on this sort of background. An image taken out of a commercial airliner's window, and this is actually a still from a video, but all the video frames look pretty much the same. This object is tootling along in the opposite direction. So is this a UFO that happened to be buzzing a commercial airliner, or is this object here, which appears to bear a striking resemblance to a particular PC game whose name I can't mention for legal reasons. This is one of the drop ships of a particular game. Okay, it's called Halo. So and you can see that if you take that and play around with it, it doesn't take too much to realize that somebody has taken a video, taken a few frames of computer-generated imagery from a computer game, and basically plonked one into the other. Very easy to do with editing software. It might take you a few minutes, but obviously these people have got time on their hands, so it might take you a few minutes to do that, but then you end up posting it to YouTube and you get who knows how many hits and people watching your adverts, therefore you can make money out of it. So it's sad but true that fakery is a fairly large part of what we're dealing with. Let me finish with the elephant in the room. Maybe UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. I have not found any images which I can honestly say are extraterrestrial spacecraft, but clearly they exist because this person has collated them all. Look at this, UFO sightings. You probably can't read this at the bottom. 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. So based on people saying they've seen UFOs, they've produced this little catalogue, if you like, of different types. This is fairly incredible because if you look at the difference between A5 and A6, they look the same to me. So the fact that you can go to somebody and ask them to describe the UFO that you saw and distinguish between one UFO and a very similar looking UFO, that's rather incredible. The second thing I find amazing about this is that this is UFO sightings set 1. So presumably there's a set 2 with another 80 of them. So I think some people believe that there are at least 160 different types of UFO that are buzzing around, some of them very simple hubcaps, some of them triangular, some of them very ornate, looking something like a, I don't know, a Klingon Batlev or something, I don't know, but there's an awful lot of them. What I find very annoying about the sort of TV programs, which I don't recommend you watch on various channels about UFOs, is that you often get the, look, there's actually positive proof. It's not just a question of UFO sightings. There was a UFO sighting, but when we went there the next day, look what we saw. Evidence that the UFO had landed. Why? Well, because it's obviously a triangular UFO, and there's its 3 feet that were left there. So they home in on that to force you to look at 3 blobs in the forest, which are just 3 blobs in the forest. But, you know, you can just look at it from any angle you like, and you can always make a triangle out of 3 blobs in the forest. But some of these documentaries, which, whether they are designed to be documentaries or whether they're designed to be entertainment, I don't know, but they certainly fall short as documentaries, trying to convince you that there is evidence that a triangular UFO has landed in the forest. Oh, what's mankind coming to? So, the lack of evidence, the lack of proof that any of these things that purport to be UFOs are actually extraterrestrial does indeed raise a question. The number of stars in the Milky Way is perhaps 300 billion or so, and we now know that most of them have got planetary systems. We didn't know this 20 years ago, but now we know that most stars have planetary systems. And we also know that there are quite a few Earth-like planets out there. So there's something of order 50 billion in the Milky Way. Now, life, of course, is a really tricky thing to work out. What's the likelihood that life may have originated? Some people say it's very unlikely. Other people say it's inevitable. To quote Jurassic Park, life will find a way. So we don't know what the origins of life are, and we don't know how likely it is. Let's assume that 99% of the time it never happens. So only 1% of those will end up originating life. Will life go from simple to complex cells? We have no idea. Let's assume that 99% of the time it doesn't. So we reduce it by another factor of 100. And what's the likelihood that we ever end up with intelligent life? No idea. Let's assume 99% of the time it doesn't happen. So we divide by 100 again. But even then, even if intelligent life is 1 in a million, that still means that the galaxy is full of civilizations. So shouldn't we have already been visited? Well, that's another question. Maybe it's just too difficult because the stars are too far apart. Maybe they would rather do it by some other means. Maybe civilizations end themselves long before they become spacefaring. We don't actually know. Do people recognize this image? I nearly got rid of that by processing the image, thinking it was a dust speck. So there, look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Pale blue dot from Carl Sagan. It's a reminder that that is all we actually know. We only know about life that's originated on Earth. We know nothing about extraterrestrial life as such. So UFOs in the skies are not evidence that we have been visited by extraterrestrials. But what I actually find more unsettling is the thought that we might be alone. Thank you for listening.